And next up, we'll have Roland Dobbins, who will talk about Bitcoins and some hacking. Just before that, a couple of notes. We're aware of Betty Burke, the executive director, let me know. We're aware of the power issues and going to work on it during lunch. So thanks for your patience in that regard. And one other programming note, there was a snafu with the schedule where it showed both lunch ending at 1:30 and programming starting in the afternoon at 1. That's been fixed, so it'll actually start at 1:30 in the afternoon. So that's the time to come back. And one of the speakers for the afternoon has graciously agreed to reschedule to Tuesday, which is very appreciated too. So with that.
Super, thank you. And clicker here?
Yep, that's it. Sorry, forward, green.
Okay, super. Hi, everyone. My name is Roland Dobbins. I work for Arbor Networks, and I'm here to talk with you today about DD4BC, your Bitcoins or your site. We're going to talk about an ongoing DDoS extortion campaign. A couple of programming notes. My slide style is very verbose. There's a lot of words on the page. The reason for that is twofold. I'm taking notes for you, and secondly, the presentation is designed to be read by those who are not fortunate enough to be with us today. So a lot of the slides I'm going to skip over. You'll have the opportunity to download the slides later. So mainly focus on me, and I'll highlight the stuff that we're going to really talk about. So DDoS attacks are attacks against availability, typically through capacity or state exhaustion. DDoS extortion is not a new thing. It's been with us basically since the days of the early days of IRC and BitNet, non-monetary extortion called coercion. We started to see monetary extortion on the internet in 1997 or 1998. So it's actually not a new thing at all. So what is Bitcoin? It's basically magic internet money. It is a cryptocurrency that is mined, so you actually have to expend computational effort to create Bitcoins, either yours or someone else's, if you hijack their machines to do it. The transactions in Bitcoin are verifiable. They're posted to a public register. There's not a high transaction fee for using Bitcoin, and the transaction fee is actually paid by the purchaser, not the vendor. There's a lot of criminal activity around Bitcoin. There's a lot of theft of Bitcoins, attack against online Bitcoin wallets to steal people's Bitcoins and things of that nature. And we've also seen a lot of DDoS activity around Bitcoin. For example, we've seen attempts to manipulate the value of Bitcoin, where we see threat actors who are launching DDoS attacks against Bitcoin mining farms and exchanges and things of that nature. One of the most important things to understand about Bitcoin is that this audience, you probably know what Bitcoin is. Raise your hands, you know what Bitcoin is. Okay, right. So if you go to the average person in the street, either they haven't heard of Bitcoin or they've vaguely heard of it, but they don't really know what it is. So it's magic internet money, as far as they're concerned. Why would an attacker want to use Bitcoin to receive extortion payouts? Well, it's an international, fiat currency, right? So you can get it and move it around anywhere on the global internet. It has the potential for at least pseudo-anonymity, kind of like cash. You can launder Bitcoin. You can run it through several different transactions very, very rapidly to try and launder it, very similar to cash. Until recently, Bitcoin had a very high exchange rate when compared to most other fiat currencies. And it's completely set apart from governments and regulatory entities, which means that it's also easy to avoid paying tax on Bitcoin transactions. And the pool of Bitcoins can be expanded to an ultimate finite limit. What is the disadvantage to an attacker of using Bitcoin? Well, it's not actually untraceable. Cash is not untraceable. Cash has serial numbers and holograms and RFID, I'm assuming, these days and everything else. So there are ways to trace cash. There are also ways, if you're persistent, to try to trace Bitcoin payouts and see the flow of currency through the Bitcoin system. it's actually potentially easier to trace Bitcoin than cash because you're not dealing with physicality here and you can automate a lot of it. It's easier in many cases to steal Bitcoins than stealing cash. You don't have to walk up to someone on the street and stick a gun in his face and say, give me your wallet, right? You can do it from the safety of your mother's basement. Bitcoin is also very highly volatile. It's much more volatile than other currencies that we see around the world. And the biggest problem is that unlike us, right, this self-selected crew of nerds and geeks, most ordinary people have either never heard of Bitcoin, or if they've heard of it, they don't know what it is and they don't know how to get their hands on it. And so that's actually a barrier to someone who is trying to collect an extortion payout. So DD4BC, it's a moniker that stands for DDoS for Bitcoin. Very self-explanatory. This is a moniker that this particular threat actor adopted. So it is a self-naming kind of situation. You get it mangled a lot in conversation. You'll see D4BC, DCBC4, and stuff like that. DD4BC is currently the most notorious DDoS attacker on the internet. About a year and a half ago, it was Lizard Squad with all the gaming-related DDoS attacks. Before that, it was Anonymous, right? So today, the DDoS attacker du jour on everyone's lips is DD4BC. How do they get started? DD4BC first emerged in July of last year and focused the DDoS extortion campaign on Bitcoin-related sites. And so Bitcoin exchanges, Bitcoin lotto sites, yes, there's a thing that's called a Bitcoin lotto site, online gambling houses that take payments and make payouts in Bitcoins were the main targets of attack. And just like DDoS back in the earlies, the Bitcoin ecosystem can be viewed by many in the mainstream. It's kind of a fringe sort of thing. It's not really viewed as being in the mainstream of business. And betting shops and things like that are viewed differently in different regions and different cultures. But just like the very, very earliest DDoS threat actors, DD4BC was concentrating on kind of a fringe affiliated with the Bitcoin movement. One of the things that most DDoS extortionists do is they'll say, okay, give us our protection money payout, and you'll never hear from us again. And inevitably, if you do pay, you do hear from them. And DD4BC will say, okay, I'm going to DDoS your site, and I'm going to take it down, and if you pay me, I'll go away. Well, from the very beginning, DD4BC followed the typical pattern and came back to the folks that paid. And as a matter of fact, the second organization we know that was attacked by DD4BC was an online sports betting house. And they agreed to pay. Now, the reason that they paid was because in the background, they were frantically implementing all the BCPs and doing all the things to implement a DDoS defense that they should have done from the get-go. And so they paid to buy time, and DD4BC would come back and want some more, and then they paid again. We don't recommend this, but that was a strategy that was employed last year. Most of the targets that DD4BC attacked during 2014 were Bitcoin savvy, and so they understood how to make payments if they were so inclined. And we see extortion payout demands from DD4BC ranging anywhere from a single Bitcoin up to 100 Bitcoins. And at the current exchange rates, that's something like anywhere from $227 US to $22,700 US. And the attraction of attacking fringe businesses is that they're not very likely to go to law enforcement. And they're viewed in many cases with suspicion, and law enforcement is not necessarily very interested in helping those types of victims. And of course, as is the case with all DDoS attacks, it's a very, very tiny percentage of attackers who actually end up in jail. And unlike what we see in the TV shows and in the movies, most criminals aren't masterminds. Most criminals are stupid. And most criminals in the criminal justice system of any country that you care to name talk their way into a court, they talk their way into a conviction, and they talk their way into a jail cell. And that's how most DDoS attackers, the tiny fraction who are caught, actually get caught, is that they run their mouths, they run their fingers on social media. So, in the first quarter of this year, DD4BC decided that he wanted to go where the money was, right? That's why Willie Sutton robbed the banks, because that's where the money is. And so in the second quarter, DD4BC started attacking financial institutions, and has done so in many geographies. In Europe, Central Europe, Western Europe, Scandinavia, North America, Asia, India, very, very broad-reaching geographical attack campaign. DD4BC has gone after banks, they've gone after online stock and commodities traders, and they've also done a bit of research or reconnaissance, and they've gone after firms that are embedded and are essential to the financial industry, but that aren't typically consumer-facing, like ACH check processors, for example, or credit card processors, and organizations of this nature. So far, no financially related organization in the world that has been targeted by DD4BC has actually admitted to making an extortion payout. We know that at least one has, but if others have, they're keeping mum about it for obvious reasons. DD4BC has attacked a few very large financial institutions, but they mostly tend to go after mid-tier or regional financial institutions. And we believe the reason for this is that DD4BC has calculated that these organizations are less likely to have the technical skills and the savvy and the resources to fight a serious DDoS attacks. And so they are more likely, in DD4BC's estimation, to be willing to pay an extortion payout. And what we saw in 2014 was that the ratio between extortion threats that DD4BC sent out and actual attacks delivered was a relatively high ratio. That ratio has gotten much lower since DD4BC has expanded its horizons to the financial. Still, they send out more extortion demands than they launch attacks, but it's a much lower ratio than before. They've also attacked ISPs of various nature, transit providers, broadband wireline providers, e-commerce sites, VPS hosters, co-location providers, etc. We saw what we think was a DD4BC experiment. Normally what DD4BC tends to do is it selects its targets, and it does enough reconnaissance to try to mine email addresses that are likely to be answered by a human being, and then sends out the extortion demands. We saw then, on the contrary, in Europe, they did an experiment, we believe, where they did a lot of mining and figured out that this particular hosting provider had a bunch of 10, 15,000 sites with different domain names hosted within their network, and sent out automated extortion spam to root ad and security ad and abuse ad. They didn't get a payout from that one, and we think it was just an experiment. DD4BC was seeing if they could get a yield from spam extortion demands versus having to do the research to actually target individuals within an organization. E-commerce sites doing online retail and trading and so forth have been targeted as well. And DD4BC are still attacking online betting shops. They're still attacking Bitcoin-related organizations as well. They haven't shifted their focus from purely Bitcoin-related organizations. They simply expanded it to include more mainstream financial organizations. And as is the case with almost all DDoS attacks, a lot of collateral damage here. Some folks believe that DDoS attacks are a legitimate form of nonviolent protest because they're not stealing anything. But the reality is that almost any DDoS attack is gross overkill. It's like trying to swat a fly with a nuclear weapon. And so we've seen several VPS and infrastructure as a service cloud providers hit. And yes, the targets did at least initially suffer some downtime, but tens of thousands of other customers were affected as well in terms of collateral damage. So how has DD4BC's MO evolved over time? Well, a typical DD4BC DDoS extortion attack begins like this. Unannounced, DD4BC will launch a DDoS attack against the website of the organization they're targeting. This can range anywhere from 15 minutes to a couple of hours, typically 10, 15 gigabits per second, something like that. Then what they'll do is they will send an email message with the extortion demand, and they provide enough information so that the recipient has a pretty good idea that whoever sent this email actually is at least affiliated with the attacker. And they'll say, okay, you have 24 hours to pay us this extortion demand, or you have 48 hours to pay this extortion demand. If the victim doesn't follow up, DD4BC will simultaneously send more emails demanding payment and launch bigger attacks. And they will also increase the demanded extortion payout over time. DD4BC attacks a relatively low, the number of attacks against people, against organizations who don't pay versus non-attacks is relatively low. So a high percentage of the targets that they actually launch the initial attack against, if they don't pay, DD4BC will go after them again. And they will increase those demanded extortion payouts over time. And if they see the targeted organization engaging in DDoS defense, they will say, okay, well, you're trying to defend against our attack, so we're going to raise the price of your payout even further. When DD4BC gets into an ongoing DDoS, a set of DDoS attacks against an extortion target, the attacks will persist from a couple of hours up to 12 hours, and in some cases, several days within the same week. However, one thing that we have noticed about DD4BC is that they will eventually cut their losses. If they are unable to gain an extortion payout, if the targeted organization are able to effectively defend against the attack, DD4BC, for the most part, will eventually go away and target someone else. We have seen them come back to target the same organizations from time to time, and on a couple of occasions, we've seen them go after the same organization multiple times. We believe this is a sense of frustration. These tend to be organizations that have little or no availability loss in these attacks because they are well prepared. They've already been through this. They know what to do. And so DD4BC gets frustrated and wants to really show them who's boss, or at least try to. And so we think that's what's going on there. So here is a typical DD4BC extortion demand. And you'll note here that DD4BC are actually referencing their own press, right? They're saying, okay, well, we're DD4BC, and you may have heard of us, but if you haven't, here's a couple of links, and we want you to pay us, and we're running an attack right now, a demonstration attack against your server. We'll stop in an hour, and so we want you to go and get some Bitcoins. And we know that you may not have some Bitcoins on hand, or you may not even know what they are, and so we'll generously give you 48 hours to get the Bitcoins. And you don't even have to reply to this message. Just send the Bitcoin extortion payment to this particular Bitcoin address, and we'll know that you paid, and you won't hear from us again. And so here is a follow-on extortion demand. So they made an initial demand. This organization did not give in, and so they attacked some more. And they said, you've got 6 hours, or we're going to start the attack again, and we're going to up the demanded payout. And this is one where the attacker was frustrated because he said, well, I see that you tried to defend your site against our DDoS attack. So, it's going to go down again. I'm going to take it down. And don't bother with DDoS mitigation because you're not going to be able to do anything. And we're going to increase the payout to 3 Bitcoins, and we will keep doubling it every day of the attack until you finally pay us. In terms of the actual DDoS attacks that DD4BC launches, at first they would start out with a mixture of NTP and SSTP reflection amplification, sometimes some DNS reflection amplification, and SYN flooding. And so after DD4BC gains some operational experience, they tend to lead with SSDP or NTP. Sometimes we'll go to SYN floods or another methodology as well. They are very, very focused on monitoring the efficacy of their attack. And if they see that the targeted organization is successfully defending against the attack, they will shift vectors in order to try to defeat those defenses. And if the second vector they go to is mitigated, then they will shift to a third vector. They will do them in combination. So they're very, very focused on monitoring the efficacy of the attack. They always, at least so far, have gone specifically after web servers. They haven't seemed to target any other type of server, service, or application that we know about. And DD4BC, they're single-threaded. They don't attack in parallel. They go after one target at a time. And they tend to concentrate in one geography. So like this week, it's Switzerland's turn, or this week, it's the United States' turn, or this week, it's India's turn. And so what they'll do is they will leap around in terms of geography, but they will launch a spate of attacks against organizations based in a particular geography and do them all serially and then jump somewhere else. That's what we've observed so far. The DD4BC attackers are not using, as far as we can tell, any kind of exotic new DDoS attack methodologies that are radically new, that are difficult to mitigate. In fact, from what we can observe, we believe that DD4BC are pretty much exclusively using so-called booter or stressor services. And these are what Jack referred to in his earlier electrifying presentation, where he was talking about botnets for hire, where you can pay, and Jack said you can pay with your credit card or your Bitcoin. Typically, attackers pay with somebody else's credit card and somebody else's Bitcoin. But you can go online and pay these folks. They have automated interfaces, so it's DDoS as a service. And that's what DD4BC tends to be using. These booter or stressor services tend to masquerade. They say, oh, well, this is a stress testing service. This is a performance testing service for your site, for your online application. But they're actually DDoS for hire. We see over time that some of the booter and stressor operators have added additional capabilities to their services. And as they've done this, DD4BC have adopted those methodologies. For example, we saw some booter and stressor services add the capability to launch a WordPress XML pingback reflection amplification attack. And shortly thereafter, DD4BC added that attack methodology to their repertoire. So they are keeping up with the publicly available tools and adopting new attack methodologies as the booter stressor service operators add those to their services. DD4BC are very disciplined. They have a methodology, the methodology that I just described to you with the initial attack and the initial extortion demand, the escalations for non-communication, the escalations for attempted defense. These are all standard, and we don't see a lot in the way of variation in those behaviors. So DD4BC have kind of a cookie cutter approach. And again, they will react to successful DDoS defense within the repertoire that they have. They will start out with one methodology. If that doesn't work, they'll switch to another methodology. They'll switch to a third methodology. Then they'll try 2 at once, 3 at once, 4 at once. Never any really radical shifts. And these are how the booter stressor services advertise on Twitter: guaranteeing power, 10 to 50 gigabits per second, and updating our amplifier list, hitting extremely hard as always. So it's very easy to go and find these services online. We have seen one innovation, it's almost too strong a word, a variation, I guess you would say, of an attack methodology in DD4BC's repertoire. So SSDP reflection amplification attacks are actually making use of a feature of UPnP, Universal Plug and Play, that has been implemented, unfortunately, on a lot of CPE devices, like small home SOHO types of CPE devices around the world, and in some cases on host directly as well. And so the way that a normal run-of-the-mill SSDP reflection amplification attack works is that the attacker spoofs the IP address of the victim, and he sends an SSDP, which is HTTP over UDP or HTTP/U, M-search enumeration request to this whole list of SSDP reflector amplifiers. And he's spoofing the IP address of the target, and all of these CPE devices that have SSDP running on their internet-connected ports then cheerfully answer the victim and pummel them with all these unsolicited M-search responses. That's how a typical SSDP reflection amplification attack works. What we've seen DD4BC do in some circumstances is a little bit different. We've seen them lead off with a regular vanilla SSDP reflection amplification attack, and when that doesn't work, they'll switch over to something that we hadn't seen before. And so at least some of these booter stressor services are actually going a step beyond scanning for SSDP reflector amplifiers. And what they're doing is they are actually enumerating all of the UPnP registered services that are sitting behind those CPE devices, which have registered with ephemeral ports on the public IP address, public IP interface of the CPE device. And they're sending HTTP/U GET requests to those ports that show up as having a UPnP registered service. The reason they're doing this is that, by definition, all UPnP compliant devices that register themselves with a UPnP control point, like a home router, they have a very brief HTML status page that lists some technical information about those different services. And this is stuff that's sitting inside the home, like a game console, like some embedded Linux device that's a media player, things of that nature. And so this particular set of booter stressors are actually enumerating those services. And the way that this attack works is that DD4BC commands whatever system he's using to launch the attacks to send a spoofed HTTP/U GET to the ephemeral port that on these various CPE devices, millions of them out there on the internet, that actually have UPnP services registered. And those devices receive the HTTP/U GET, and they dutifully return the status page for these UPnP services sitting behind the CPE, almost always NATed. And they pummel the target. The attack profile looks a little bit different because instead of, as with a normal SSDP reflection amplification attack, instead of seeing the attack traffic emanating from a source port of UDP 1900 on the CPE devices that are used as reflectors amplifiers, it's coming from some pseudo-random ephemeral port. The packets tend to be around 400, 500 bytes in size. The attacker does yield multiple packets for a single request. We believe that the amplification factor here is something around 8-to-1, 10-to-1, something of that nature. So what does a normal SSDP reflection amplification attack look like? We have our initiator over there on the left-hand side of the slide. The initiator decides he wants to attack 172.19.234.6. So he sends SSDP M-search request, which again is HTTP over UDP. He sources this request from the port that he actually wants to DDoS on the receiving end. The most typical port we see the attackers use is UDP80. Does anybody know why? The reason is that a lot of non-specialists don't really know the difference between TCP and UDP, and or if they have any instrumentation at all they see is port 80. So it's kind of a form of obfuscation. And so the attacker will source the M-search request from the IP address, the spoofed IP address. This is why BCP84 is so important. He will spoof the IP address of the victim, say, okay, I'm going to source this M-search request from UDP80, And I'm going to send this request up to all these SSDP-enabled devices, which again, a lot of them are home Soho CPE devices. Some of them are Windows boxes that have a UPnP toolkit enabled and things like that. The request is about 119 bytes in size, and so the request goes out. And so what happens is, all of these SSDP reflectors and amplifiers dutifully respond to the victim with these unsolicited SSDP msearch responses sourced from UDP 1900 on the reflectors amplifiers to the port that the attacker chose on the first leg of the attack, in this case UDP 80. We see yields of up to 9,800 bytes in these responses, and there are typically two distinct traffic streams that we see. We see the initial fragments, which have the source and destination port. So source port UDP 1900, destination port 80. Then we see the non-initial fragments, which of course don't have source and destination ports. And the important thing to note about any reflection and amplification attack is that on the reflector amplifier to target leg of the attack, the source IPs are not spoofed. Those are the actual reflectors amplifiers that are emitting the traffic. This variation we talked about works a little bit differently. You see up here at the top all of the different devices that are sitting behind these CPE devices. So our attacker again spoofs the IP address of the target, and he's sourcing his request from UDP 80, but he's not sending it to UDP 1900. He's sending it to whatever ephemeral port the previous enumeration scan showed that a UPnP registered service was attached to on each of these particular reflector amplifiers. And he sends this HTTP/UGET. And all these devices, some of these responses are cached by the CPE, some of them actually live. They gateway the request all the way back behind the net to the home devices, and they reply. Sourced from the ephemeral port going to UDP 80, anywhere from 300 to 500 bytes. And of course, this impacts the victim, the target of the attack. It can cause problems in intervening networks. And it also actually has a negative impact on the folks who are unknowingly running all of these reflectors and amplifiers as well. This is what it looks like. And this is a layer 7 decode from Wireshark. Wireshark will decode HTTP/U just as it will TCP-based HTTP. And you see here this location URI. So this is the location of the status page that the attacker is sending the GET to. And you'll notice that that's an RFC 1918 address. So this is actually sourced from behind the NAT, behind the CPE device that's acting as a NAT device. We see this is some kind of Linux device running a UPnP SDK. This user agent redsonic, so this is being relayed back by the CPE reflector amplifier responder. Attackers often don't know a lot about TCP/IP, and they try something once and it works, and so they kind of have a cargo cult mentality. They say, well, I did this once and it works, and I don't know why, so I'll do the same thing over and over again. At some point, whoever it is who wrote the actual attack tool code that is doing this UPnP variant attack decided for some reason to use the user agent redsonic in those HTTP/U GET requests. This maps onto a company in California that makes some kind of embedded Linux distribution that's used in a lot of home appliance type of devices. And it consistently shows up in this attack variation that is launched by DD4BC. So here's another one, very similar. Again, we see an RFC 1918 address, and of course the port number is there as well, and the name gatedesk.xml. So this is coming from the home router itself, we believe. Again, it's running Linux. We see our redsonic here. We see that the UPnP string is a little bit different, though, than in the previous one. And so this is a different type of device from a different vendor or a different operating system version or build. This one is different yet again. Can anybody tell me what's different about this one, the circle in red? It's routable, right? It's a routable IP address. So this is not an RFC 1918 address. This is a routable IP address. And also the URI, TX Media Renderer. In UPnP speak, this is some kind of device that can receive streaming video or audio, transcode it, and then play it for the viewer. And we see this is a Windows box. So this is actually apparently a naked Windows box sitting on the internet. And of course, we still see Red Sonic. And here, the UPnP identifier reflects that audio-video transport identity that we saw in the URI. Finally, we have this one. This one is different yet again. Can somebody tell me what's different about this IP address? Right, self-assigned, that's right. So this is a device that tried to get a DHCP address and failed. So it's using a self-assigned address. We also see WPS device there. What does that mean? Well, that's related to wireless protection system, right? And we see here, sure enough, if we look at the UPnP registration information, we see that this is apparently a Wi-Fi access point that's sitting behind some kind of home router. So who is DD4BC? What is DD4BC? Based on lexical analysis of all the extortion emails that we've seen, we believe that DDBC is relatively fluent in English, but is not a native English speaker. DD4BC got really exercised over the 4th of July holiday in the United States, started sending out a financial organization a bunch of extortion demands, and was very upset when he didn't get a response, and so started launching DDoS attacks and stuff like that. In the United States, the 4th of July is the second most widely known holiday after Christmas and New Year's. It's a 4-day weekend, it's a banking holiday, and so anyone who's familiar with American culture, such as it is, would probably know not to send an extortion demand to a bank over the 4th of July weekend. So we don't think DD4BC is very familiar with American culture. DD4BC is serial in nature, not in parallel, attacks a single target at a time. This, plus some other factors, leads one to the conclusion that DD4BC may well be an individual. This is my personal theory. I think it's probably a single person. I could be wrong. DD4BC is reasonably tech savvy. DD4BC knows what Bitcoin is, knows what a DDoS attack is, knows what a booter stressor is, and uses them somewhat effectively, but he's not really a big innovator. We don't see exotic attacks from DD4BC that are difficult to mitigate. And we also see that DD4BC may be a little bit naive, because one of the worst kinds of targets you can go up against if you're trying to stay free and avoid law enforcement involvement is financial institutions. And that is right where DD4BC has expanded. So not very smart in that regard. Basically, DD4BC hasn't been caught yet for a number of factors. First of all, because only a very small percentage of DDoS attackers are actually caught due to the pseudo-anonymous nature of the internet. And also because DD4BC so far has utilized relatively good operational security. DD4BC doesn't run his mouth a lot, went after fringe organizations, at least initially. He's willing to cut his losses and move on from target A to target B to target C if he can't get a payout. And though DD4BC in the extortion emails will claim 400, 500 gigabits per second of capacity, so far the biggest attack we've seen from DD4BC is about 60 gigabits per second. Now that's not insignificant, but it doesn't choke all these peering links and transit links and core links and cause a huge amount of interference with bystander traffic that is passing through intervening networks. It really starts to add up as the various reflector, amplifier, source packets start to topologically converge towards the target. So it's not big enough to cause a huge, huge problem. DD4BC's attacks rifts are kind of sporadic. He'll do a few and he'll stop, and he'll do a few more. He'll move from one jurisdiction to another, and only attacks one at a time. And again, we think that part of the reason DD4BC, even though he's very prolific and is notorious, hasn't been caught, is because he keeps his mouth shut. So what do we think is going on with DD4BC now and in the future? Well, the first thing is that imitators have sprung up. DD4BC has become so notorious that we have seen imitators spring up in different geographies around the world claiming to be DD4BC and sending out extortion emails or posting extortion demands on pastebin.com or regionalized pastebin types of sites in relatively poor English, not up to DD4BC standards. And that UPnP variant that we talked about that yields those 300 to 500 byte packets, we haven't seen that from these either. We believe that as the booter stressor technology and features evolve, DD4BC will adopt them. We think he'll do more in Asia, but language is a very significant barrier there. We believe that English is a second language for DD4BC. We don't think he speaks any Asian languages. Same thing for Latin America and South America to some degree. You do have Spanish, you also have Portuguese. Same thing for Africa. If DD4BC remains active, we think at some point he'll branch out beyond financials and Bitcoin-related stuff to other verticals as well. DD4BC has attracted a posse. Because DD4BC has gone after financials, he's attracted a lot of heavy heat from law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies and security researchers around the world. So there's a lot of eyes looking at DD4BC right now. And we believe that if DD4BC continues attacking financial institutions, this dramatically raises the probability that he might actually be caught. How do you defend against DD4BC? All the standard BCPs, the IACLs and the GTSM and your DNS architecture. Make sure you have flow telemetry so you have good visibility in your traffic. You can detect and classify and trace back an attack. The standard reaction mitigation tools like source-based remote trigger black hole and flow spec and intelligent DDoS mitigation systems. Full disclosure, I work for a vendor of the latter. ACLs are really key. And those of you who are familiar with my rants about how ACLs are not a good reaction tool may be surprised to hear me say that. But ACLs are not normally they don't lend themselves to static reactionary defense, but having reasonable network access policies enforced in front of a server or service makes sense. UDP-80 should never make it to a web server. You can say, well, if DD4BC is even launching a 60 gig attack, he can fill up the last kilometer or last meter transit link of the target. That's true. But there's still value in keeping those packets off the actual public IP address of the servers. Because they don't have to deal with the traffic. And if, let's hope not, but some folks still do tend to put servers behind devices that are ridden with state, like stateful firewalls or so-called IPS devices, those devices will go down just like that, and they'll take 30 or 45 minutes to reboot. So ACLs are a key. We advise organizations if they get an extortion email, they should immediately contact the relevant law enforcement agencies, their upstream transits or their peers. They should, if they have an MSSP that's providing security services, let them know as well. If they're involved in any industry-specific groups related to security where information is being shared, let those folks know as well. And if they're part of any of the closed OPSEC communities that are vetted, let them know that you've received an extortion demand as well. Play for time. Pretend you don't speak English. Pretend you don't know what Bitcoin is. Engage in some dialogue here and try and string this person out, this group out, while you're contacting your law enforcement and your peers and your upstreams and making sure that your DDoS defenses are sound. We urge you, most of all, don't pay. If you pay, eventually it will probably come out. It's going to make you look bad, and it incentivizes the criminal to come back and hit you again and again and again. So DD4BC is prolific, long-running campaign, reasonably skilled, reasonably good operational security. So far, he hasn't talked his way into a jail cell. He's very focused on the efficacy of his attacks and will vary his methodology depending on the efficacy of a given attack. He seems to know when to cut his losses in most cases and move on to the next target. We don't think he's an American. We think it may be an individual. And again, that's my personal belief, is I think DD4BC is one person. All the standard BCPs and stuff that you've read about, heard about here at NANOG's past and seen me or heard me ranting about in my little corner of the internet, those all apply. There's nothing exotic here. The max capacity we've seen for DD4BC is about 60 gigabits per second. He will adopt new DDoS attack methodologies that are supported by the commercial booter and stressor DDoS as a service providers. He's got a long-tailed posse in multiple jurisdictions after him. He will go away if you defend successfully against him, and he can be defeated because we've helped defeat him multiple times. So, questions, comments? A couple of people making their way to the microphone. By the way, this QR code, you can use your QR application on your smartphone to snap that and download the presentation, also the short URI. Yes, sir, microphone number 2.
Nick Harlan, Microsoft. Can you comment about efforts to follow the money through the Bitcoin blockchain for people who have paid?
Are you asking, is there an effort to track money? Is that your question?
Yeah, I mean, Bitcoin transactions are public record. And
There are multiple individuals and organizations working to track it. Absolutely, good question. Microphone number 2 again.
Matt Petak, Yahoo. So you mentioned that you've got this UP&P vector where they can actually enumerate, capture the response, and then go after the sources behind it. This would imply that instead of it being a spoofed source, at some point the command and control system is actually using a real reachable node to do the M-search, enumerate, and capture those responses. Do you know if people are doing honeypots to look for non-spoofed sources?
Right, so that's a very insightful question. So the questioner's point is that whoever is launching reflection amplification attack has to go through an enumeration stage to discover and enumerate these various types of reflectors and amplifiers out there on the internet. And the question is anyone looking at the scans to see if they tend to triangulate somewhere? The problem with the internet is background radiation, okay? The vast majority of packets that are out there are actually garbage packets, right, first of all. And everyone and his dog, right, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog, they think you're a security researcher. Everybody on his dog on the internet is constantly scanning. And the attackers are scanning in many cases they're scanning from compromised systems, and in many cases they're scanning from systems that have different IP addresses from the botnets or the booter stressor services that they're actually using to launch the attacks from. And so they engage in that kind of OPSEC. Another thing that they do is they identify IP blocks that are not masqueraded very well, that obviously are part of security research organizations, and they don't allow those, to scan them. They do a lot of obfuscation, and so that's why it's a good question, but there's just so much noise that it's very difficult. But thank you. Microphone number 1.
Phil Rosenthal from IS Prime. So about the booter and stressor services, you said they advertise it as like, oh, this is a stress test, and I mean, realistically speaking, people here may actually choose to buy, a stress test from them. I'm sure that's not the primary business. But that said, if they were a legitimate business selling the service, they would be buying transit and actually launching it from their own networks, but they're not doing that.
That's
they
correct.
are bouncing it off of things on the public internet.
That's right.
Therefore, it is trespassing, it's theft of services. Why doesn't law enforcement look at it that way?
What you and I and everyone else in this room knows versus what lawmakers and regulators and law enforcement agencies in different jurisdictions around the world know are sometimes very, very different things, right? And to your point, the nature of a reflection amplification attack tends to militate against the excuse that this is just a traffic generator that's used for legitimate stress testing, right? And you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, the law hasn't caught up, and there's so many jurisdictions worldwide. There are jurisdictions where the rule of law does not hold sway. And by the way, that's where most of the current floating population of SSDP reflectors and amplifiers lives. There's in a couple of jurisdictions where the rule of law doesn't tend to hold sway. And so that's part of the problem as well. If you look at human history, crime has always been with us, okay? We have skulls, right, from the Pleistocene era, in 50, 60,000 years ago, of human predecessors that were obviously murdered because we can tell, forensically looking at the holes in their skulls, that they were attacked with a blunt or sharp instrument. Crime is part of the human condition. The internet's part of the human condition, therefore crime is part of the internet condition, right? It's always going to be an issue. The biggest thing that folks can do, of course, is to implement anti-spoofing, ingress policing at their edges for anti-spoofing, BCP84. We also strongly urge broadband operators to proactively scan your customer base, the access IP ranges, to flag CPE devices, which are reflectors and amplifiers, and encourage your customers to remediate those devices or fire those customers if you have to. Great. Any other questions, comments? Okay, you've been a great crowd. Thank you so much. Go and enjoy your lunch. Thanks a
very
lot.
much. Thanks. Great. Thanks, Roland.